The Happy Warrior Podcast, conservative commentary on the news of the day from a more positive perspective.
Hello and welcome, everyone. It is great to be here with you again today. My name, of course, is Happy Warrior Pete, and this is the Happy Warrior Podcast. I know many of you missed having me with you last week, but it frankly just couldn't be helped. It was my birthday, and I was working on an alternative journalism project that I would love to share with you, and I will do so when it is published. But for today's episode, we will be discussing the climate hysteria, which, of course, we have the wonderful Greta Thunberg. Yeah, Greta Thunberg. That's how you pronounce it. I looked it up. Everyone's favorite autistic teenage version of the Swedish Chef. So we will get into those later in the episode. But I have the tremendous blessing and honor to invite my friend John Ziegler onto today's podcast. John Ziegler is one of my very favorite reporters in the country. He is the number one expert on the Jerry Sandusky Joe Paterno case. He has been for the longest time basically the only one, or close to the only one, that is willing to get to the hard truth of this story, to find evidence, to figure out who's guilty and who's innocent. And turns out, actually, the people who you think were guilty are innocent. The people who are innocent seem to be more guilty. And it was John Ziegler that did all that research and homework all on his lonesome, even when others would not back him up. Well, it turns out that the wonderful Malcolm Gladwell, a guy who tries to be intellectually honest and is someone that is respected by both the political left and right, decided to take up the torch that John had been bearing almost by his lonesome for the last 8 years. Well, wouldn't you have it that the wonderful Malcolm Gladwell, one of the last intellectual journalists that people both on the left and the right still respect, decided to take some flame off of John's torch and to carry it too. So he included a chapter about the Sandusky Paterno case in his newest book, Talking to Strangers, which is excellent. I highly recommend the audiobook version, by the way. And to celebrate Malcolm's book release, Malcolm did sit down with John and they discussed at length, it's an almost 90-minute episode, about the Jerry Sandusky case. And you can find that interview. It is an excellent interview. I listened to it twice. You can find that on The World According to Zig, which is only one of the two podcasts that John Ziegler hosts. The other one is Individual One Podcast, which is more punditry, Trump-related. I recommend both of them. I'm a regular listener to them and greatly enjoy them. If you do not know about his work on the Sandusky case, you are probably familiar with him for his work taking apart the Jussi Smollett case. He was one of the very first journalists that was willing to actually poke the obvious holes into Smollett's story. There were lots of reporters and police that were saying privately to each other that it was obvious liar, liar, pants on fire time, but no one was willing to say it except Mr. Ziegler. Other thing you might know him from was he was the leading guy to take apart the Michael Jackson documentary, Leaving Neverland by HBO, which has enamored Ziegler, oddly enough, with the Michael Jackson fan community, which I find enjoyable. I always like seeing on Twitter all their support for John, so that's kind of cool. So our interview will talk a little bit about all these things, but it will mostly focus on the Jerry Sandusky story, John's attitude about it, where the future of the case is, and what's going on. What's the connection behind all these stories that he is so very good at sniffing out when they break his BS meter. So please take a good listen to Mr. John Ziegler and enjoy. All right. Hello, everyone. I have today for this special episode of the podcast a favorite journalist of mine, John Ziegler, who you can usually find writing over at Mediaite. He's done a couple of documentaries. The reason why I'm bringing him on, and we had him on 7 months ago, we talked about the Jussi Smollett case, which Ziegler was one of the first people to poke holes in. We want to talk today about the interesting updates he's seen with his coverage of the Sandusky / Joe Paterno case, which John Ziegler is the expert number one on this subject. So the one of the few people left that both people on the left and the right respect these days is Malcolm Gladwell. And Malcolm Gladwell decided to vote a chapter based on Ziegler's work taking apart the Sandusky case. And I just read last night. It's in his book, Talking to Strangers. It's a pretty good book. I enjoyed it, and the chapter's well done. And I don't know, this is all pretty dang exciting news, and I was like, oh, I'd love to have John back on to talk to him and ask him about it. So here he is. Welcome, John.
Thanks for having me, Pete.
Okay, so let me just say that, John, I think I've told it to you before, but you're one of the journalists I really deeply respect. I think how you always seem to try to hold true to your principles, and this last year, that's led to some really positive stories that you were integral on. Just in this last year, we had Jussi Smollett. You were one of the first people that was willing to actually say what the police were saying was, this is just all BS. Then you became a darling of the Michael Jackson fan community when you took to task the documentary Finding Neverland. Just last week, or a week or two ago, when the New York Times tried to take out Kavanaugh for the umpteenth time, you were one of the first people to take that part. And now, in your busy year, Malcolm Gladwell has picked up your work. So tell me, what's your feeling? What are your feelings about all this? And
well, it's funny that you described it that way. By the way, just for the record, the HBO film about Michael Jackson is called "Leaving Neverland."
Oh, sorry.
And it should not be referred to as a documentary. It should be referred to as a fantasy fiction film. But the way you described it there, it sounds like a pretty successful year. But my feelings are that it's been a dreadful year. And in a rational world, it should be a very successful year. But we don't live in that world anymore. And, we're living in a world where facts don't matter and logic doesn't matter. And I predicted before the Malcolm Gladwell book came out, which was really the topic on which I truly am. It sounds like hyperbole, but I truly am the world's foremost expert on the Penn State Joe Paterno Jerry Sandusky case. And the first person that would tell you that was Jerry Sandusky, because he doesn't know hardly anything about the case because it didn't actually happen. So that's the one I was most looking forward to. But I had very low expectations when the Gladwell book came out. I knew it was coming. I had spoken to Malcolm Gladwell well over a year ago and given him numerous documents in preparation for his chapter. The chapter was pretty much what I expected, which I had low expectations for, because the number one thing people need to understand about the whole Penn State Joe Paterno Jerry Sandusky case is the reason why, or at least the number one reason why the media blew it and everybody else blew it, is because it's toxic. And everyone's afraid of telling the truth. It's kind of like Jussi Smollett on steroids, where the Jussi Smollett case, no one was willing to talk about the truth on that because here we had a celebrity who was black and gay and therefore protected, especially in a place like Chicago. Well, you take that and you put it on steroids, and that's the Penn State Joe Paterno Jerry Sandusky case, and then you have a whole other set of political factors that are integral to understanding how and why this whole thing went down. So, it's my opinion that Malcolm Gladwell did not provide his true 100% unvarnished opinions in the book because of the toxicity. And I had very low expectations for what the reaction to the book would be. In fact, I half jokingly, half seriously said that it's great in a rational world to have Malcolm Gladwell endorse your work. and claim, in an interview that I did with him, that I will be vindicated in this case, at least to a certain degree. But I would actually prefer to have had Kim Kardashian tweet about it and Donald Trump retweet it. That's the world we live in now. In all seriousness, had Kim Kardashian tweeted my article and interview with Malcolm Gladwell that I did for Mediaite, which is my current pinned tweet on Twitter, and Donald Trump retweeted it, which, by the way, wouldn't be insane. First of all, I live pretty darn close to Kim Kardashian, and I've spoken to Donald Trump in 2014 about this case, and he sent me a congratulatory letter signed for my work on this case. So, I'm not talking about something that's completely insane, but if those two things had happened, not that I expected them to, I would be in far, far better shape than I am with Malcolm Gladwell, even though that's preposterous because, Gladwell has spent an enormous amount of time researching this, has an awful lot of credibility. It's in a highly vetted book. It's a best-selling book. It's the number one best-selling nonfiction book in America right now. So, in a rational world, this should be, if not a game changer, at least something that moves the ball significantly down the field. But that has not happened. And in fact, in many ways, this has actually been, like almost anything that happens in my life that should be good, it's actually been a net negative for a number of reasons. So it's been demoralizing, but not all that surprising.
Oh, I can tell you're always the optimist.
Well, no, I'm just a realist. I'm actually delusionally optimistic. People call me a pessimist all the time, but almost all of my pessimistic predictions not only come true, they actually end up being too optimistic. The Gladwell situation is a perfect example. I had very low expectations for the Gladwell book and made some predictions about what would and would not happen. And frankly, those pessimistic predictions were too optimistic. It's been worse than what I anticipated. And that has happened on numerous occasions. It's happened in all sorts of different elements of stories that I've covered. And by the way, I think there's some similarities. I think there's similarities to the whole Penn State Joe Paterno, Jerry Sandusky situation, to the Donald Trump story of his coup in the Republican Party and why no one will stand up against him within the Republican Party. I think that there's similarities to the Kavanaugh story. I think there's similarities to the Michael Jackson story and yes, the Jussie Smollett story. They all have very similar traits, and they've all turned out, in some ways, not all, in some ways worse than I even expected.
I get what you're saying. Yeah, you're like Jeremiah the prophet. You kind of have this feeling for what's going to happen, and knowing what's going to happen and being right on it doesn't mean you like the outcome any better. No, I get that.
Well, no, I that's 100% true. In fact, like I said, I actually think I'm somewhat too optimistic at times because I'm a big believer in having hope and trying till the whistle blows or the horn sounds. I never give up, but I'm also very realistic about what is possible. And we're just living in a world now where, and this sounds like an exaggeration or whining or whatever, but it's just true. Facts don't matter. Reality doesn't matter, especially if it's complicated and involved and takes too much time and requires people to think. That you cannot defeat a politically correct, simple narrative, no matter how lacking in facts it is, because if the popular majority and the powerful majority, especially in the media, buy into a particular narrative, and in the Penn State Joe Paterno, Jerry Sandusky case, they didn't buy into it. They became as deeply invested in it as you could possibly become within 2 days. Within 2-3 days of the story, they became completely invested in a narrative that's totally nonsensical and without any factual basis. Well, there's no going back. And, and I've done so, but I could easily, off the top of my head, and this is not an exaggeration, I could spend 10 hours easily, without repeating myself, explaining, I could do it off the top of my head, explaining why everything people think they know about the Penn State Joe Paterno, Jerry Sandusky case is not just a little wrong. It's totally wrong. It's 180 degrees from reality. It's upside down. The good guys are the bad guys. The bad guys are the good guys. And it's not close. And the other side can't do anything close to that. And the other side won't debate me. They won't even interview me. Even after the Gladwell book, they won't even interview me because they can't possibly combat my side, which is based in fact, in logic, and in a narrative that actually makes perfect sense, as opposed to a narrative that is completely nonsensical, which is what the entire media industrial complex bought into in November of 2011 when the whole Penn State Joe Paterno, Jerry Sandusky case exploded. And only Malcolm Gladwell within the mainstream news media has been willing to at least take a second look. And even he, as I said, I think is being exceedingly politically correct in the manner in which he did so.
Okay, so for listeners, the chapter, it's a pretty good book overall. I enjoyed it. I listened. The audio, I tried out the normal and the audiobook, and the audiobook version is much better. I don't know if you've listened to his chapter on your stuff. It was pretty good. And it didn't feel like it was ducking the question as much as the book does. I think so. Basically, if you don't know, in the book he concedes much of the premise that's underneath the Sandusky case, but he just does not make that final leap that says, well, maybe that investigation, the public lynching of Sandusky in the first place, was wrong. He just can't quite make that jump. And I think did the Wall Street Journal take him to task?
Yeah, that whole thing is very, very interesting, and in a rational world would have made significant news. But for the record, Gladwell told me in my interview that the Sandusky case is shrouded in doubt, and that I've raised a lot of really good points about it. And he is unsure whether Sandusky is actually guilty of child molestation or not, but he just can't say. He describes himself as agnostic, conveniently so, on that topic. And then the Wall Street Journal wrote a full-page review of the book, Talking to Strangers, in which they spent about 3 paragraphs citing me and another author by the name of Mark Pendergrast, who wrote a book called The Most Hated Man in America, that also comes to the same conclusion that I did eventually after years of looking into this, that Jerry Sandusky has to be innocent. Mm-hmm. And the Wall Street Journal reviewer essentially, and you have to read between the lines a little bit, but they take Gladwell to task for what they refer to as being lazy. I would say they really meant a different word, probably more like cowardly, to being too lazy to admit that the ultimate conclusion of his chapter is that Jerry Sandusky is innocent. And, Gladwell has told me that people have read his book and concluded that, and I think he takes pride in that, which, by the way, he wouldn't take pride in that if he didn't believe that that's a very likely scenario here, at the very least, that Sandusky is innocent. But we all have to play a game here because Malcolm Gladwell has a lot to lose. He's got a very good reputation. He sells best-selling books. He can write about pretty much whatever he wants. He gets to be interviewed by Oprah Winfrey. And so, he's not going to throw that all away for a guy who really has almost no chance of having anything other than his life end in prison for the crimes that he did not commit, which is Jerry Sandusky. I mean, that's the situation. And I know the people who haven't studied the case and haven't thought about it since 2011 or 2012 when Jerry Sandusky was convicted 7 months after his arrest, which is insane, especially given the circumstances of the case. I know the people who haven't thought about it. This all sounds nuts. I get that. I mean, I thought that this concept was nuts when I first started looking into it. I started looking into it from the standpoint of did Joe Paterno, the legendary Penn State football coach, who got fired 3 or 4 days after the story broke and had his 61-year career at Penn State ended in ignominy and then died 2 months later, I thought, okay, this doesn't sound right. My BS detector is at an 11. It seems to me like he got a raw deal. That's where I started on this. And I did a documentary film called The Framing of Joe Paterno, which people can find for free at YouTube. and that's where this all began. But it was only after a couple of years of investigation and interviewing Sandusky not once but twice in prison for a total of 6 hours that, and then reinvestigating the whole case, because this is not the conclusion I wanted to come to. Trust me. There are people who actually think that this is what I wanted, which is just crazy. I wanted to be able to find that Jerry Sandusky was guilty. I mean, that was my goal. I tried to prove that he was guilty, and I could not do it. And I couldn't come close to doing it. And the more that I found on almost a daily basis, I find things still to this day that are completely inconsistent with his guilt. And then there's still things happening. I mean, I spoke just yesterday to the soon-to-be ex-wife of the number one accuser in the case, Aaron Fisher, victim number one, who is in the process of divorcing him and has made a criminal complaint against him for assault and rape. And this is, I mean, I realize we live in a world where sexual abuse victims can do and say anything, and they're still sexual abuse victims. But I'm sorry, if you know the whole Aaron Fisher story, there's no way that he was abused by Jerry Sandusky, and nobody around him thinks that he's a credible person. He is a bad person who is a liar. And even kids who were his friends at the time of the alleged allegations say, no, there's no way this happened. He doesn't show any of the signs. He never said anything about it. Some of the things he's claimed are not true. And so, I find it very, very interesting that, and I'm the only person in the world that would think about this, but, the three people at the center of this case, from the prosecution standpoint, were Mike Mcqueary, the graduate assistant who allegedly saw Jerry Sandusky in a shower with a boy, which is what Gladwell's book really takes apart, that whole scenario, and Aaron Fisher, and Aaron Fisher's mom, who is named Dawn. Now, Dawn has several last names. I don't even know what the heck she's called at this point. But it's fascinating that unless a minor miracle occurs, that within a few months, or certainly by next year, Mike Mcqueary, Aaron Fisher, and Aaron Fisher's mom, Dawn, will have all been divorced since this case broke. All of them are rich and famous and considered heroes in the media, but they will all be divorced. Meanwhile, Jerry Sandusky's not divorced. Graham Spanier, Tim Curley, and Gary Schultz, the people who were sentenced to prison in this case, they're not divorced. And John Ziegler somehow is not divorced. I would submit to you that if the factual record was as perceived, there is absolutely no possible way that those three people would all be divorced, supposedly on the good side of the case, and the other five people I just named, supposedly on the bad side of the case, would somehow still be married. It's not possible.
No, I think you're right. I think, to be fair to Malcolm Gladwell, he has had the last few years. He also has been trying to walk the media tightrope that's required if you want to be a mainstream darling. Is that you really, there are just certain things you cannot even be skeptical about. I mean, just by not even saying that Sandusky was innocent, or not even really going hard on the story like you have, he is still now. Hey, I just shared with you these articles from Deadspin, which are they're pretty angry filled rants against him. It's this, you cannot go off the farm. You cannot even express the most modicum amount of
Well, Deadspin is invested. Deadspin is like a 5-year-old child in Santa Claus in this case. Deadspin was the first outlet. I'll never forget it. It was the weekend the story broke. The first outlet of any major note that actually said that Joe Paterno was going to get fired over it. And I was like, what? You've got to be out of your minds. And they went on a virtue signaling campaign, driving the rest of the media, including ESPN, in that direction. And they got what they wanted. Well, now they're totally invested. And they're not going to do anything that would have, forget about Sandusky, they're not even willing to open the new information that Gladwell provides them about whether or not Joe Paterno could have possibly been culpable in all this. And that's there's so many problems with the media narrative, but the most obvious problem with the media narrative in this case is that not only is Joe Paterno not to blame, let's pretend Jerry Sandusky is guilty, which is not. But let's just pretend Jerry Sandusky is guilty. If Jerry Sandusky is guilty, Joe Paterno is not only not culpable, he not only did exactly the right thing based upon the NCAA's current handbook, but without Joe Paterno, Jerry Sandusky is still free and playing golf right now. And that's not an exaggeration. Joe Paterno is the only reason why Jerry Sandusky was arrested. Joe Paterno is the last person the prosecution spoke to that we know of just before his arrest, because his grand jury testimony was so vague. And here he was, an 83, 84-year-old legend who was the most respected man in the state, and they needed to make sure they had him 100% on the record, backing up Mike Mcqueary's version of a 10-year-old story, where they have the absolute date, month, and year totally wrong, and still do to this day, according to Malcolm Gladwell and me. But if Joe Paterno doesn't say to them, "Yep, I back up Mike," in that last interview, I am morally certain they never pull the trigger and even arrest Jerry Sandusky, because all that has to happen for their case to fall apart is Jerry Sandusky get arrested, the Mike Mcqueary story become public. The public learns that Tim Curley and Gary Schultz, the two Penn State administrators who actually spoke to Mike Mcqueary, don't back up his story. And Joe Paterno, the great Joe Paterno, gets asked by the media, "Hey, what did Mike tell you?" All Joe has to do is say, "I don't know what Mike told me. It was 10 years ago. It's a 3-minute conversation. I thought we were talking about a job that gets opened up." That's all that has to happen. And the case is over. The case is over, because then Mike Mcqueary has zero credibility. He only has credibility because Joe Paterno, and then unfortunately the Paterno family, by extension, for reasons that are maddening and somewhat complex, but the only person on the planet who probably fully understands them, also got invested in Mike McQueary's bogus version of events. And that was really the point of no return in this whole story. But I totally agree with you. There are certain things that if you want to be a member of the club, the mainstream media club, you cannot go outside of the herd on. And this is one of probably the top 5, which is, especially in the sports world, that you cannot go against the herd on Penn State, Joe Paterno, Jerry Sandusky. This is like going against the herd on man-made global warming and climate change. You can't do it, because you're a bad person, you're a moron if you don't accept what we have stated to be the truth. And by the way, there's some similarities, I believe, in the mindset that makes people believe in man-made catastrophic global warming, climate change, and belief in the entire Joe Paterno, Jerry Sandusky, Penn State media narrative. I think they're pretty similar concepts.
No, I agree. I think, that's kind of what makes, you kind of have a special place there to talk about cancel culture, because at least for the, what we could consider the modern era, the last 10 years, really the Jerry Sandusky case was this first kind of public lynching. I think it even predates the Twitter girl that got fired for making a stupid joke while she was on an airplane. I think it just kind of, I don't know. It doesn't seem like it's based very much in fact. So it seems just like one more of these moral panics. You talked about the Kavanaugh stuff, but last year, I think, no, I doubt anyone forgets, but people may forget how ridiculously heated that got. I mean, we had videos of young adults, teenagers, 20-somethings, literally throwing themselves at the doors, the physical doors to the Supreme Court building while Kavanaugh's being sworn in. I mean, I had a someone that was close to me, when I tried to express this to Kavanaugh, her message was basically like, when you act skeptically about the Kavanaugh story, it's the same thing as re-traumatizing me. And well, I don't know. It's this scary attitude I see in seeing people. Like you said, they've moved so far away from the facts that.
Here's what's happened. I mean, obviously a lot of these stories we're referencing, the Jackson story, the Sandusky story, the Kavanaugh story, They all involve allegations of sexual abuse. And in my view, what has happened here, and this happens in our culture all the time, that there is a problem that comes to light, which is, you know what, maybe we're not being sensitive enough to sex abuse victims. And maybe this lack of sensitivity is allowing some perpetrators of sexual abuse to go unpunished. And this is obviously wrong, and this is something that needs to be corrected. All in favor of that, right?
Yeah,
But what ends up happening, especially in such an emotional issue, especially when a moral panic is involved, and there absolutely was a moral panic involved with both. There's a bit of moral panic in all three of those cases, Jackson, Kavanaugh, and Sandusky, Paterno. So once a moral panic is involved, people lose their minds. What ends up happening? Well, you dramatically overcorrect. The pendulum swings from one extreme to the other. We, for some reason, can never keep the pendulum in the middle. And so now, especially post-Me Too, things have gotten so insane to the other extreme that we've gone from not being willing enough to believe sex abuse victims to now believing all sex abuse victims, no matter what they say, no matter how nonsensical, no matter how against the facts, no matter how lacking in corroboration, no matter how compromised by self-interest, whether it's money or politics or whatever, and it has become effectively impossible to defend yourself. I mean, part of why I got involved in the Michael Jackson case is because when you know the story of one of the two accusers, for sure, and maybe both of them, but one of them is a guy by the name of Wade Robson. Now, Wade Robson's story, I am positive he was not abused by Michael Jackson. And if you know the basics of his story, if he is allowed to be to have his story be unrepudiated and be accepted as fact against a dead man, a cultural icon, then in all seriousness, it is impossible to refute anyone's allegation because his own words refute his own allegation. I mean, the guy testified under oath in a highly publicized trial as an adult where he was a very seasoned person, a celebrity in his own right, who had had numerous affairs with prominent women. He knew obviously knew all about sex. He was very worldly. He had been a celebrity since he was a little boy, effectively. And so the idea that he, as Michael Jackson's first defense witness, went up on the stand under oath and not just lied, but specifically lied. I mean, he was asked very specific questions where he vehemently denied ever having been abused by Michael Jackson. And this is just one of dozens of data points I could provide you. But that alone, that we're just going to pretend that a testimony under oath in a criminal trial is irrelevant and is not enough to contradict someone's current story that they're suing for millions of dollars when they suddenly change their story after the person they're accusing is dead? I mean, come on. I ask all the time, and I have to tell you, I've been asking this question for at least 6 years. I ask anybody, please tell me what would be legitimate evidence of someone not telling the truth when it comes to a sex abuse allegation. And the sex abuse cultists, terrorists, they call themselves advocates, whatever, no one can tell me. No one can tell me. By the way, just like global warming, I ask the same thing. Tell me what would be evidence that global warming might not be man-made and catastrophic. No one will tell me. They don't want to say. And it's the same way with sex abuse. And I'm like, I'm sorry, that's a problem. Because people make stories up, especially when there's money involved, and especially now that they're so protected by political correctness that no one can criticize them, no matter how ridiculous their stories are. Dave Chappelle got holy hell at his most recent comedy special on Netflix for calling the accusers of Michael Jackson lying motherfuckers. And I believe he was right. And only Dave Chappelle was willing to do that because he's Dave Chappelle and he doesn't seem to give a shit. And so anyone else does that, they get canceled. And this is a very dangerous situation. And I believe Brett Kavanaugh is totally innocent. I think the most recent effort by the New York Times to do a hatchet job on him proves that. I thought Michael Jackson was guilty when I first started covering this in 2005. I was a Los Angeles radio talk show host when that trial happened. We covered it on almost a daily basis. I presumed he was guilty. I didn't disagree with the verdict because it was clear that the prosecution case was crap, but I just presumed, okay, they couldn't prove it. Well, now I've gotten deeply involved in this and looked at these most recent allegations, which are just ridiculous. They're absurd. I believe Michael Jackson was probably innocent as well. And I'm positive that Jerry Sandusky was innocent for a million different reasons. And these are just the cases that we know about. It makes me feel like if these cases where the vast majority of the public and all the media is convinced that they're guilty, then who else is getting railroaded? Yeah. Because it's so easy to do now because the rules are so in the favor of sex abuse accusers, and it's dead set against, impossible to prove your own innocence. I mean, even if you somehow prove you weren't even there that day, they still come up with some explanation. Well, the trauma caused the accuser to misremember the date or whatever it is. I mean, there's always a way to rationalize, and it's not healthy. It's very, very dangerous.
Well, thank you so much, John, for letting me interview you. I'm always rooting for it. So I love these little updates about where the Sandusky story is. I know you've fought through a lot of setbacks and disappointment. I think you just had USA Today was about to come out with something. And the guy that was doing it just left work just the day before.
Yeah, that pretty much encapsulated the entire Sandusky case. For over a year, I was working on a USA Today investigative sports reporter by the name of AJ Perez, and I got him to go to State College, interview Jerry Sandusky's wife, Dottie Sandusky, and a whole bunch of other people. I got him an interview with Malcolm Gladwell, got him the Malcolm Gladwell book. It was all planned so that he would write an article about the Malcolm Gladwell revelations on the day that the book came out. It was all set to go. He had written it, and then he quit his job that day. And a lesser man at this point, probably would have blown their brains out. But for me, this is just par for the course. This is just the nature of this case. And this kind of stuff continues to happen. It's cursed in every possible way. I interviewed AJ about this. You can check that out on my podcast from a couple weeks ago at freespeechbroadcasting.com. It's a SoundCloud and iTunes podcast, The World According to Zig. Yeah, I mean, look, Jerry Sandusky has a resentencing hearing coming up because they screwed up his sentencing. His sentencing was illegal, but I don't believe that will cause any justice to be done because the politics are such that I'm sure he'll probably get more time in his resentencing just because of the virtue signaling involved. His lawyer's a moron. I did a whole podcast about that. I'm done with his lawyer. He's a complete idiot. He's butchered the Malcolm Gladwell book opportunity. A federal court, I think, would be horrified by this case, and that's where it's heading. But I don't have any confidence that Jerry's representation is going to be competent enough to make the right arguments. And so I pretty much resigned myself to the fact that an innocent man will die in prison. Joe Paterno's reputation will never be restored to what it should be, and I will never be fully vindicated for what should have been a career-making body of work. I mean, I made a lot of mistakes in this case, but what I've done has been widely ridiculed, but in a rational world should be applauded because I found the truth where no one else was willing to do it. I checked the math on a case where the math doesn't make any sense, and I was able to redo the math in a way that makes perfect sense, but very few people give a damn because we don't care about the truth anymore.
All right. Well, this was talking to Mr. John Ziegler. You can find him, of course, at Mediaite. He regularly writes there. Also, he has two podcasts. I think their names are World According to Zig, which is the one that has the Malcolm Gladwell interview.
Individual one.
Yeah, forgive me. My bad. I'm sure you'll find him again in the news. You seem to have one of the most accurate, most attuned BS sniffers for these cancel culture stories. So I am sure that you're going to be at the front line again of another one in the coming year. So,
well, thank you for your time, Pete. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. You are wonderful. You take care. Bye. All right, guys. So there you have it. That was my interview with Mr. John Ziegler. I enjoyed it. I perhaps had a cheerier thinking of where that story's going and what it means for the future, but my nose isn't to the ground. I haven't seen everything that John has seen, and so he probably has the better picture, but I just probably have an over-optimistic outlook. From my point of view, I think that where this story is going on Sandusky is getting better and better. I mean, there's been so many frustrations and problems, and the steps have been so imperfect, each one, and so hard, okay? So very, very hard. But I'm just feeling optimistic. I don't know. I just get this feeling that the truth is going to come out on this one. I can't really explain it. I just have this feeling that if America is good, and Americans are good, and even not today's Americans, but the future's, that they'll look back eventually on this story and realize their mistake. So I don't know if that means that anyone whose life was destroyed will have some recompense. Sandusky will be freed, that kind of thing. I just don't know if that's going to happen. But I do think that at some point, history will remember that John got this story right. And that does mean something. Well, that is my opinion of the matter. Thank you to all the Ziegler podcast peoples who decided to take a listen to the interview today. You are more than welcome to come back to this podcast. I thank you for being here. All right, my friends, we will take a quick break and come back with all the climate hysteria that you can stomach. All this and more on the Happy Warrior Podcast. Before we begin, I want to play this incredible montage from Grabian Media.
We owe it to the young people to give them hope. But I don't want your hope. I don't want you to be hopeful. I want you to panic.
We have been polluting the earth for years, and we might actually die in a few years.
Our world is already in flames. It's getting hotter. We can't breathe.
We are here because our parents trashed the planet, and it's up to our generation to save it.
Unlike so many people my age, I feel really visceral anxiety about climate change.
Call us Generation Z, the last letter of the alphabet, because we are going to be the last generation to survive.
My conscience couldn't handle the idea of bringing someone into a dying world.
I'm angry because this planet is dying and the president of the biggest country in the world refuses to acknowledge that.
And I'm sick of the future that they put on us.
I am here for the people who are suffering and dying because of our country's decision.
People are suffering. People are dying. Entire ecosystems are collapsing.
Our oceans are choking with trash, and the 6th mass extinction is well underway.
We do not have time to be polite. This is a revolution.
It doesn't matter how much we're taxed if we don't have an earth to live on.
We need to do more instead of having a corrupt president who won't acknowledge that the earth is literally dying.
This is environmental racism, and we must acknowledge the issue.
We need to listen to our children because they totally get it.
Because every day of inaction drives more action from us!
You have stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words. And yet, I'm one of the lucky ones.
So, with the exception of that first clip of Greta Thunberg, which I think is like maybe a year old, the rest all took place within the last 7 days. What I just played is a portent of America's future. And man, if that doesn't make you feel bat flip crazy, I don't know what will. That is just, oof. Ugh. I want to discuss what all this means. A lot of pundits have talked about it, but I think they've missed the bigger picture. What we saw with the climate strike this last week had very little to actually do with the climate. Instead, what we are seeing is the new American culture, the new American religion. When we in the West said that we no longer wanted to do that God thing, we no longer wanted to do that religion thing, well, something had to replace it. Humans do not live in nature in a vacuum. There has to be always something to replace God. Now, people who aren't into religion, let me explain what that means. I'm not saying you have to have a God, though. You do. You have to have a higher purpose, and you have to have a fundamental philosophy and theology that explains why in this cruel and unfair world there is still good and why we have a purpose in this life. One of the things I struggle with when I work with chronic pain patients who are suicidal is that many do not have religion in their life. And I know that seems counterintuitive, but when you have religion in your life, when you have faith, it teaches you that there's a point to living. Without it, it's like what the great book, Suicide of the West, one of my favorites, is that you lose purpose and meaning in life. It changes from life being, you come here to life to grow, to do good, to serve others, to enjoy culture, art, refinement, all the beautiful things that happen in this life, everything that makes life worth living. And you say none of that matters anymore. You replace it. You replace it with pleasure and how comfortable you are. And if you're a chronic pain patient who's been denied their pain medication to survive, you have no faith that there's a purpose to this life, that there's a purpose to the suffering, to the unfairness, there's a purpose to it. You take that away and you say, there is no purpose to life. There is no God. Do you think that makes them less likely to commit suicide or more likely? The answer is obvious. Well, it's really important that people have a purpose in life. They have to have a reason, a deep, fundamental piece of their soul that tells them why they are here on planet Earth. And this is why the environmental stuff is so damaging. Because in the West, because of our affluence, our money, our wealth, because we've moved so far away culturally from our history, we've moved so far away from any kind of theology. And I'm not even saying it has to be my theology or your theology. I'm just saying theology, period. Okay, if everyone wanted to start picking up Buddhism, that would be better than what we're doing now. We need a reason for living. So what's happened is, and there's this amazing essay in The Atlantic from Jack Booker, which it's really long, it's like 20,000 words, about how children in New York are no longer being taught what they need to know. That if you actually want an education for your kid, you have to pay through the nose for it, often $30,000 a year per child, because otherwise they will just basically receive nothing in education. Instead, they're taught about all the evils of America with no context, none of the good. Instead, they're taught about activism. Instead, they make dioramas instead of understanding history and the world and how we got to these issues and the multiple sides of it. They got rid of all that and replaced it with lazy activism, environmentalism, intersectionality. New York is a microcosm of what the West has done to itself. And the scary part of all this is that behind almost every kid at these climate strikes, at these climate conferences, are parents. Behind each of these children are families. This is such a disgusting thing. But what happened this last weekend is speaks as much to what we've done to ourselves, psychologically, spiritually, fundamentally, but also what we've done to our families as parents, as uncles and aunts, as grandparents. In a lot of these videos, there's a parent standing behind the kid. There are parents telling their kids that this is how you do it. This is the way life works. This is all fundamentally dangerous because all these children will grow up. One of the problems we're seeing with the Democrat Party right now and why the rise of socialism is so strong is because there are many people catching on that what they've been taught for the last 50 years, that the Democrats don't actually have a real plan of making most of it happen. This is the most true when it comes to environmentalism. Okay, my mom can remember when she was in elementary school and they were warning about global climate change and overpopulation. Okay, so this isn't new, but people are going to catch on that you're not serious. And we have replaced, see, the difference between this youngest generation and my mom's generation is my mom's generation at least had that fundamental underlying ethos to live by. These children do not. What has replaced it is media and entertainment and activism. And those are poor substitutes for a good life. But they are a hell of a drug if you're a politician and you want to make political change happen. So when the kid's saying this, that this is the start of a revolution, they're right. They are completely correct. This is a problem people on the right, we make this mistake all the time. So when someone tells you that they believe in something and they want something, that they're going to do something, you need to take them at their word. Okay, unless you have evidence otherwise, that they believe otherwise, that actions speak louder than words. You have to take them at their word. And what are these kids saying? What are these kids saying? Let me play this clip. This is from a college not too far away from where I'm recording this. So this is the college fix went to St. Olaf College, which is just like less than a 3 hours drive from my house. And the college student, he went to their climate protest. There are about 1,000 students that vacated the class and were marching around the town of Northfield, which is pretty small. And this kid, this college reporter, I shouldn't call him kid, this young man, actually went up to them and said, hey, what do you mean? What do you believe? What do you want to happen? And listen to what they are saying.
So I've heard this figure thrown around in recent months that we have about 12 years left to live before climate catastrophe ensues. What are your thoughts on this, and what's your plan?
I haven't seen that figure, but I'm sure it's believable, and it's concerning, the lack of time that I think we have left.
I think it's a super serious statistic, and that people should recognize that that can be truthful, that we need to enact change as soon as possible to prevent that from happening.
Yeah, I'm baffled at the fact that we're talking about so many other issues when this is the most pressing and affects everyone equally. We're not going to have a life if we don't do something about it right now, so we need to start acting immediately.
One thing I'm kind of wondering about is this statistic I've been hearing that in 12 years the Earth will be uninhabitable. Do you guys buy into that?
Yes, of course. Yeah.
Yeah?
And it's very serious.
Huh. What do you plan to do to fix it?
Coming to strikes like these and really fighting for it.
Bruh, come on. All right. So you think that capitalism and climate justice are incompatible?
I do think so, yes. I think the overconsumption, and I think our lifestyle, the lifestyle that people live here, the life of comfort, is definitely what causes that, yeah.
So what steps could we take to reduce this life of comfort and become more sustainable?
I think there needs to be a shift in our lifestyle. I think we need to make our lives a bit more uncomfortable, the way they should be. I think we should be learning of the consequences of all the actions that we take.
I am very serious that if conservatives and libertarians do not wake up and realize what is coming our way, if parents do not wake up and realize the schools and the education systems in most cases are not on your side. They are not trying to raise children to have familial ties. They are not trying to educate children so that they understand and have a deep understanding of our country's history, of the arguments of where we've been and where we're going and why America is a net positive in the world. They are not being taught this, guys. And if you do not educate your family and your kids with some fundamental reason for being, then you failed as a parent. This is a mass failure of parenting. This is a mass failure of society. This is what decadence looks like. Where our most pressing concerns are these fairy tales we tell ourselves about the planet ending in 12 years, 18 months. Not that the science reflects it. The people that came out with the IPCC report from the UN say that this is not what they said at all. But that doesn't matter. The facts actually don't matter all that much. It's the hysteria, the moral panic, the energy, the activism, how much they truly care. We got to watch out. This is dangerous. This is dangerous fuel. This is the fuel of revolutions. On the economic things that these climate hysterists want us to do is crazy. Like, for example, we have to move to solar panel, even though that won't be able to support even 10% of our energy needs. We have to get rid of meat. That's what my man Andrew Yang said. No more meat for anyone. We have to end our flights. We have to fundamentally remove all the blessings of modernity and capitalism so that we can save the planet. So what exactly do you do then, Peter? What do you exactly want us to do? You laid out the problem, that's great. But how exactly do we actually change things and help people to return to sanity and principles? Well, I'm glad you asked. I would turn you to Prime Minister Scott Morrison, the Prime Minister of Australia, who laid out the solution, the way we can help especially our young people to return to sanity. Take a listen.
Like many leaders here, I get many letters from children in Australia concerned about their future. I take them very seriously and I deeply respect their concerns. And indeed, I welcome their passion, especially when it comes to our environment. My impulse is always to seek to respond positively and to encourage them, to provide context, perspective, and particularly to generate hope, to focus their minds and direct their energies to practical solutions, things they can do, positive behaviour that will deliver enduring results for them, to encourage them to learn more about science, technology, engineering and maths, because it will be through research, innovation and enterprise that the practical work of successfully managing our very real environmental challenges is achieved. We must respect and harness the passion and aspiration of our younger generations. And we must guard against others who would seek to compound or worse, facelessly exploit their anxiety for other agendas. We must similarly not allow their concerns to be dismissed or diminished, as this can also needlessly increase their anxiety. What parent would do otherwise? Our children have a right not just to their future, but to their optimism. Above all, we must let our children be children. Let our kids be kids. Let our teenagers be teenagers, while we do the work positively together to deliver the practical solutions for them and their future.
That, my friends, is how you do it. We need to be enabling the young people. We need to be enabling Americans to the good life. We need to encourage them to grow and learn to harness their passions and use them for productive means, not just screaming at the top of their lungs in front of their peers. Okay? There is something positive. We could possibly channel this craziness to a positive end. And I'm not talking about a revolution. I'm talking about maybe a return to those great principles that allowed the West to thrive and succeed and to beat out the rest of the world. I'm talking about returning to sanity, common sense, and wisdom. Rule of law, freedom, and justice. The secret sauce that made America what it is. I appreciate Scott Morrison, the Prime Minister, who spoke so candidly and honestly and wisely at the UN. Okay, President Trump did speak there, and it was kind of a fun speech. But Morrison was the adult in the room. And I big high five to him. That was awesome. So it is not a done deal that we will fall into a moral panic. It is not a done deal that we can't return from this crazy place that we've put ourselves and our children. We can turn this thing around, but we will not be able to do it unless people wake the frick up and start teaching their families the true principles. You can no longer rely on the schools. You can no longer rely on the normalization of politics that used to happen in America. What I'm referring to is that there's this idea that people will go off to college. They become social justice-y and progressive. Then they'd return to the real world, have to pay their taxes, and they, because their attachment to institutions in real life, would slowly return to normalcy and conservative principles. That's no longer happening, guys. People don't pay the taxes like they used to, but more importantly, we never really leave college in the same sense. We're still connected via social media. We don't have these fundamental institutions that would pull us back and bring us back to common sense. We don't have them anymore. They exist, but people aren't going to them. So we need to wake up and start doing better. What has been done to Greta Thunberg? What's been happening to Greta is barbaric. It is child abuse. What these parents that let their kids go up on stage and yell into the microphone, that is child abuse. That is the decaying of the family structure and what parents are doing for their children, and it is gross. So please, guys, please do better. Be better. I know you can do it. You know you can do it. So please go ahead and try. Before we go, I'd like to encourage all of you to check us out on social media. We are Happy Warrior Pete on Facebook and Minds.com, and we are at Happy Warrior P on Twitter. If you want to email me any questions, comments, concerns, you can reach me at pete@happy-warrior.net. Again, pete@happy-warrior.net. You can check us out for the podcast proper with Anchor. Because we switched to Anchor from Libsyn, we lost our old iTunes page, but we're supposed to get another. It's supposed to come any day now, but my producer friend who helped found the podcast is no longer working with us actively. He had a scare for his grandma, and so he has to go this week and weekend to go support her. So if you guys could please keep Robert in your prayers, please be patient with us. I know we need to get an iTunes page back so we can get the reviews and to make it easier to share this podcast. I understand. And remember, you guys can always check us out on Facebook video and YouTube. Whenever I make an episode, I'm now trying to put out a video on Facebook and YouTube. So please, there's so many ways to check out this podcast. Please spread it around. Word of mouth is way more important than rate and review. The rate and review is important. Anything else? No, I think that is it for now. Thank you so much for listening, guys. You all are so awesome. Thank you so much. I hope you take care. You stay safe. Thank you again to our veterans. People in the military, past, present, and future. Thank you to our firefighters and policemen, all the people that sacrifice sweat, blood, and tears that makes it possible for us to live in this wonderful country that we do. I salute you. And to all my listeners, I salute you too. Thank you. That will be all for this week. Until next time, good night, America.
Thank you for listening. The Happy Warrior Podcast, hosted by Peter Von Pischke, produced by Robert Maley, a production of the Sioux Empire Podcast Network. Learn more at happy-warrior.net.
目印にしてここに